All right, thanks everyone, and welcome to the panel on increasing ICANN's accountability and the critical internet resources of IANA and the ICANN transition. The whole genesis of this was a panel that we had last year that went so well at the 2014 IGF-USA. So we brought back previous panelists who've been central to the planning on this transition in the community, in the administration, and on Capitol Hill. I'll introduce them in a minute. My name is Steve Bianco, and I'm Executive Director of NetChoice, and I was able to work with Stephanie Duchesneau of Neustar to organize this panel. So to quick level set for those who haven't been paying attention for the last 16 months, America, sure enough, invented the core internet technologies and promptly gave them away to the world. And then we saw internet hosts appearing around the world by the 1980s. In the 1990s, there was an explosion of commercial use of the internet based on a naming and numbering system also created in the United States, the DNS. In 1998, the Clinton administration privatized and internationalized DNS management by setting up IANA and ICANN. And then a few years ago, nations such as Russia, China, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia have sought United Nations resolutions to sort of bring that domain naming function under intergovernmental oversight. And then last March, the administration announced an intent to transition its management of the IANA functions and ICANN oversight that goes with that away from the United States government and over to the global multi-stakeholder community, and expressly not turning it over to governments or any other intergovernmental organization. So let me quickly introduce our panelists. Their full bios are in the program. It was available when you came into the room, and they're also on the website. So from your left to your right, we start with Becky Burr, who's the Chief Privacy Officer and Deputy General Counsel at Neustar. She's a member of the Accountability Working Group you'll hear about today, and author of the white paper that actually created ICANN. And next to Becky, we have Matthew Shears. He's the Director of Global Internet Policy and Human Rights Project at CDT, the Center for Democracy and Technology. Matthew is also on the Accountability Working Group. And then next we have Fiona Alexander. She's the Associate Administrator at the Office of International Affairs for NTIA, that's the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And she's also co-author or lead author of the Affirmation of Commitments, the 2009 document that still represents a bilateral agreement between the US government and ICANN. And then we have David Redl. He's Majority Counsel for the US House Commerce Committee and the shepherd of some of the congressional oversight over this ICANN transition. And then finally, to the end of the table is Dr. Steve Crocker, CEO of Shinkuro, but also chair of ICANN's board, and as you just heard in the last panel, co-inventor of the internet. Now, three of our panelists were on last year's panel, plus Dr. Crocker's imposing presence from the audience. There were 4 takeaways from last year's panel on this subject. The first was a widespread belief we needed an improved and independent judiciary for ICANN as part of this transition. The second was we felt the need to bring the affirmation of commitments into the ICANN bylaws instead of leaving it out there as the last remaining bilateral agreement involving just the US government and ICANN. There was a real call to try to bring some predictability to the stakeholders who count on ICANN's governance. And some of that's driven by a lot of the back and forth that goes on as we try to figure out the new GTLD program. And finally, the fourth takeaway last year was that the accountability mechanisms that we want to design for ICANN aren't based on looking backwards in the past, but based on looking forward. We want accountability that will work for the ICANN we hope to have for the next 10 years, not the last 10 years. So to get started, we're going to ask a series of just 4 questions that are setup questions, and then we'll allow the panelists to have 1 or 2 rounds of answers to that. If they keep their answers to under a minute each, we'll have plenty of time to get through that and leave time for audience Q&A. So the panelists will give you 2 bites at every question. There's no need to jam all of your talking points into that immediate answer. So let's start with this. Now that we're 15 months after the US announced the transition, do you still think it was the right decision and made at the right time? And happy to start with you, Dr. Crocker.
Thank you, Steve. Well, it's certainly the right decision. As a matter of timing, when ICANN was formed in 1998, it was anticipated that the transition that we're now talking about would have taken place shortly, estimated around the year 2000. So in that sense, this is surprisingly late by that. Now there's any number of reasons that are not too hard to find out, changes in administration, events in the world, and a number of other things. So I would separate the question, is it the right decision from the right time? It's the right decision. Any time is the right time. It's never too late to fix things or to move on to the next step. This is really not so much a fix as it is a natural transition to the next step. And I'll just leave it at that and leave room for others here.
Thank you, David.
And as a congressional staffer, it's certainly not my job to decide whether it was the right transition time or the right question to be asking. But I think what is clear from what is in the .com Act, which the committee that I work for passed unanimously, and it passed through the House overwhelmingly, is that it is certainly something worth investigating and something that the Congress wants to have an active role in having oversight over the course of the transition time. Whether it's the right decision, that's something that'll be made once we have all the facts in front of us, right? The process is currently ongoing to see what the transition will look like and what the timeline will be. So I'm not sure that that it's my job to opine on whether it was right or not, but we are certainly in the middle of a process to determine whether or not that's the case.
Thank you, Fiona.
Well, I think it'd be difficult for me to say no to either of those questions. But obviously, yeah, we're still convinced that this was the right decision to make, and I think the evidence has borne out that the timing has been correct. You know, we saw the announcement in March. Soon after, we saw the success at Net Mondial. 6 months later, we saw a success at the ICU plenipotentiary, with more governments and more stakeholders participating and defending and engaging in the system. And as Larry said earlier today, you know, the evidence of the work and the amount of energy and effort, and I can't remember what the statistics are, how many hours of phone calls people down to this end of the table have been participating in, and others in the room. And that commitment demonstrates this clearly was the right time to make this decision, given the amount of energy and vigor that people have taken up to take on this challenge.
Yeah, the evidence of all the work that's being done is as much a function of the fact that you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube if you wanted to. Once the transition were underway, for whatever the reasons are, all of us have really put our shoulder to it to try to drive it through. Matthew, what are your thoughts on whether still looking back, was it the right decision at the right time?
Absolutely. And there's been a couple, I'll just take a different perspective on this. There's been a couple of mentions this morning about the World Summit on the Information Society. If you go right back to 2003 and 2005, it was the US government's role, or the perceived US government role at the heart of the DNS that was one of the big issues that came to the fore in those discussions on internet governance. And now we're removing that element from the discussion. And I think that will bode very well in terms of how we deal with governance issues going forward. And what it means effectively is that governments in ICANN are now on an equal footing. And that is an important factor as well when we talk about governance and the geopolitics of internet governance. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. And Becky?
Absolutely, it is the right decision. I am on the record for years as having encouraged earlier internationalization of the management of the IANA functions. Having said that, I think that the timing has allowed us to take advantage of the fact that the community itself is much more mature, and its skills in being multi-stakeholders have developed quite a bit. And so I think that the nature of the transition is going to benefit from the timing, notwithstanding my preference would have been to have it occur earlier.
Fantastic. So this group of experts with a lot of experience in this feels unanimous that it was still, looking back 15 months, still the right decision made at the right time. So now all that remains is to do it right. So do you think, I'll give you a two-part question, do you think NTIA's original requirements for the transition are enough? And then what about the additional oversight from Congress and the .com requirements that David Redl and the Commerce Committee have been working on? We'll start at your end, Becky.
So I very much like the requirements that NTIA announced. I think that they cover the waterfront in terms of the IANA functions. Having said that, I also like the fact that the community came together and demanded an additional requirement in the form of accountability. From my perspective, it's very healthy. We saw extraordinary cohesiveness in the community to demand that the accountability issues be addressed at the same time. So I think taken together, we have the right requirements. I think that the approach that Congress has taken on this in the form of the .com Act is quite reasonable and constructive.
Thanks, Becky. Matt?
Yeah, I think that having gone through the process of, because I was also on the IANA Transition Working Group as well, having gone through this process, what we've been trying to do the whole way was to really ensure the continued security, stability, and resilience of the internet. That's been our driving kind of mantra. And that means that requirement was really foundational and so important. The other ones are, as Becky said, absolutely important as well. I think the one thing that I do like about the .com is that we're very comfortable with its calling out the importance of the accountability enhancements and how central they are to the transition itself. Thanks.
Excellent. Fiona?
Obviously agreeing with Becky and Matthew here. Obviously our criteria were very sort of broad brush in terms of what we were expecting and asking stakeholders to fill out as to how to address this and give us the specifics. But I think to Becky's point, the community did say we want some broader accountability, which we fully endorsed and have made this part of the package. And that package is evidenced in the .com Act that David and others have worked on the Hill. And at NTIA, we appreciate the work of our colleagues and the bipartisan efforts to sort of get us all on the same page. So yeah, I think we're in a good spot in terms of meeting the clear criteria that we established on March 14th, making sure that the appropriate accountability improvements to ICANN are addressed and have been adopted as required.
David, there's been a lot of love for the .com Act.
Yeah, and I had to take yes for an answer, Steve. Thank you, and I certainly agree with the things that were said all along about the accountability measures being an important aspect that the multi-stakeholder community insisted on. My bosses clearly thought that was a good idea. Mr. Shimkus clearly thought that was a good idea in incorporating it into the .com Act. Just a brief word about sort of the oversight requirements and where they came from. I think we've been really pleasantly surprised to see that the revised .com Act as passed the House has been very well received by the international community. We, over the course of the year between the first .com Act and the second .com Act, we heard a lot of folks in the international community saying, we need you to respect the multi-stakeholder system. We need you to respect that we have a process for this. And our response was, well, we expect reciprocity. The U.S. government has a process too, and that Congress has an oversight role over NTIA. So having framed up a piece of legislation that accurately reflects the Congress's role in this as an oversight authority and as an authority that should have a role in reviewing any of the decisions that are made by the agencies under their jurisdiction. We're really happy with the bipartisan consensus that we could achieve on that and that it was so well received by the community.
Thank you, David. Dr. Crocker?
I know there's a lot of rhetoric about whether at ICANN we're resistant to improved and enhanced accountability. I can tell you very, very strongly that that's not the case, that we're deeply conscious of the responsibility that we have and take a lot of confidence and sense of being able to do our job right exactly because there is accountability. It's a very dangerous position to be in if there isn't, and we like nice, strong guidelines and clear processes. ICANN's been evolving continuously over its entire history and will continue to evolve even after this transition, and always with a very strong focus on trying to improve our processes. As a matter of form, we don't comment on legislation, but I'll go one step and say that it is comforting to have a reasonably, the .com Act hasn't quite made it all the way through, right? It's through the House, but not yet through the Senate and through the president. But let's assume that it passes. What it does provide is a greater sense of clarity about what the process will look like, and that's very, very helpful.
And we'll get to that process as well. So once the accountability train was launched a little over a year ago, it went on two separate tracks. The first was this notion of the three functions that are in the IANA, the naming, the numbers, and protocols, and the other is the notion of general ICANN accountability and enhancing it in the absence of any role at all of the U.S. government holding the IANA contract. So this ought to be a very quick round of answers, because on July 31st, the IANA track is rolling out for second round of public comment the combined proposal for how names, numbers, and protocols would be transitioned. So I would just ask the panelists, based on their understanding of that IANA part, does the plan that IANA's come up with, does it match NTIA's criteria? And do you see any concerns where folks in the multi-stakeholder community, including governments, might take issue with some of the proposals that are in the first track of IANA? Steve, would you like to start?
So to be clear, you're dividing this round into what's going to come out from the ICG at the end of July.
That's right.
Versus the accountability from the CCWG.
That's right.
And the CCWG is meeting this weekend in Paris, and there will be. It's not yet clear exactly what's going to come out from there, but with respect to the IANA part. Yeah, I think there's a very high degree of comfort, frankly. There's some specific details that I think have to be knit together across the three operational communities that each submitted proposals. I can tell you from my perspective, and I think from my colleagues in both the board and the staff, that there aren't really any issues that we have great concern about. That in terms of what that proposal looks like, and we're prepared to be helpful whichever way. So we're ready to implement, frankly.
Fantastic. And the panelists have differing degrees of knowledge of what's in that IANA proposal. So I'll look for a show of hands. Which of the panelists want to comment a little bit on the IANA? Becky.
So my personal preference would have been to have a simpler approach on the names portion of the IANA transition. I always felt that the direct consumers of IANA services, registries principally, were in a good place to ensure the operations on behalf of consumers and end users and registrants globally. Having said that, this is a multi-stakeholder process. There are lots of views. People disagreed with that perception. I think what has come out is a very reasonable balance of the different perspectives on that, and I think it's implementable and will work.
Fantastic. Matthew, you were part of that team. What's your perspective?
It's an interesting one because I think from the very beginning we had such a diversity of views on what should comprise that package, that proposal, from those who wanted to see some particularly external forms of oversight to those who wanted to see the IANA functions brought very much within ICANN. So we've had a very robust 6 months of discussions on how do we get to a point where we can all agree on something that does provide a certain amount of legal and structural and functional separation, but still between the IANA functions and ICANN, but still satisfies those who wanted to see them very much linked for purposes of continuity and stability. And I think we've achieved that balance. It's a very fine balance. But again, as I think others have said, we need to see what comes out of the accountability track to ensure that we have the right mechanisms and the accountability enhancements that will make the transition work. Because now the IANA transition part of it is very much dependent on what measures come out on the accountability side. Thanks.
Fiona, any observations as to whether the plan will meet NTIA's requirements?
Well, maybe just start with a question, because we sort of have dived directly into a lot of acronyms and assumed a certain knowledge base in the room and those online. Is everyone in this room actually following this issue at a great level of detail and knows clearly what the three functions are and what the processes have been?
Hands up if you know but names, numbers, and protocols. Looks like about 2/3 of the room.
Okay, so maybe just a little bit of a back step, which is as a result of our announcement and ICANN moving forward with the process, the IANA Stewardship Coordination Group was created, if I got that acronym correctly, the ICG. The ICG basically identified sort of three primary customer groups: the naming community, the protocol parameters being the IETF, and the IP addressing folks or numbering folks being the regional internet registries. And I see John Curran from Aaron is here in the audience. And so each of those three customer groups then went back into their communities and went through many extensive rounds of conversation and consultation. The RIRs I know actually had conversation in each of the 5 RIR communities, then collectively pulled it together and then put that out for comment. So each of these customer groups has done in and of itself its very extensive debate, discussion, round of public comments on their solution. These 3 pieces of the solution are now coming together. The ICG will be putting that out for comment. I understand July 31st is their date. And they're going to be asking some key questions, such as, does the collective package meet the NTIA criteria? So with that in mind, I think it'd be a little bit premature for us at NTIA to comment until we see the public record. But just to point out that the public record that gets developed through this next round of the process is going to be very critical to our evaluation of whether or not the system has actually delivered on what we asked.
And the IANA track, as difficult as it has been, is the easier of the two. And so let's turn to the accountability track. It left the station quite a bit later than the IANA transition did because it really wasn't part of the original transition design. The original transition design was to simply move IANA and that would be it. But the community felt quite strongly, broadly when I speak to the community, it's those from the private sector, from the business community, from governments, civil society, and engineering community felt quite strongly that before the last tether of leverage in the IANA contract was let go by the US government, that opportunity had to be there to get some lasting, significant enhancements to ICANN's accountability to the stakeholders it was designed to serve. And that's the second track about ICANN accountability. So I would note that the IANA proposal that will be released for comment at the end of July relies upon the accountability track to bake into place 4 or 5 key elements of accountability, such as an independent review, the ability to leverage the needed powers that they have to be sure that the IANA functions are fulfilled properly once they're in ICANN's custody. So I would ask the panelists, and I'm going to take a show of hands who wants to tackle one of these good questions, is how would you assess the progress so far of our accountability enhancement working group against the objectives that it has, as well as the need to try to coordinate it to occur along the same timeline as the IANA transition? First hand up, Becky.
So I don't think that the IANA task was all that simple, but I do agree that this accountability track is enormously important and involves an enormous, not an enormous number of issues. I mean, we really focused on the 4 key things that we wanted to put in place. But having said that, to get it right has involved and will continue to involve an enormous amount of work. And so I think that we still have a lot of work to do, but I believe that there is consensus for the sort of the pillars that we put together back in January. And I think that there's an enormous amount of commitment to working through the rest of the issues on a time frame that facilitates moving forward with the IANA transition. There's absolutely unanimous commitment to not be a factor delaying that moving forward. And so people are really spending hours doing it. I think, some basic questions, including the form of the organization and how the community powers get exercised. Those questions are still very much in the debate, but I believe that, and I hope that we will be able to really run those to the ground in Paris in the next 2 days. And then a lot of things will fall into place.
I certainly hope so. Matthew, you were one of the co-authors of the section of this proposal that brings the affirmation of commitments into the bylaws of ICANN. So I would ask you perhaps to add that to your commentary on how do you assess the progress of the accountability work.
Yes, that work, by the way, was under the guiding hand of Steve. So if there's any blame for that, I'll point to Steve. But on the accountability, what's been very clear from the outset is that we wanted to see in place some enhancements that would take place or be committed to prior to the transition, and what we called work stream 1. And then we had work stream 2, which were the accountability measures that would be ongoing or would take place after the transition. And now the focus is very much on wrapping up work stream 1, and it's very important that those work stream 1 measures that we've all agreed in the past be in place or committed to by the time of the transition to allow for the transition to go ahead. The work stream 2 issues are important also because those are ones that will shape the accountability mechanisms at ICANN going forward over a longer period of time, and they may well take longer to implement, and they may be issues that come up on an ongoing basis that we may need to consider. So I think it's important to see this as kind of a two-step, but as a package as well. On the affirmation of commitments, there's absolutely no doubt that the affirmation of commitments have shaped the way ICANN operates at the moment in terms of its accountability mechanisms and its review mechanisms. And it's also absolutely true that in many ways that shaped the culture of the organization. So it would have been inconceivable in my mind, and I think it's probably safe to say the same for Steve, that we would not incorporate those reviews and those processes and very much those culture shaping elements of the affirmation of commitments into the bylaws, which is what we're currently discussing. And obviously the affirmation of commitments is something that the US government and ICANN can walk away from. So we felt it important to bring those in and to really make them a part of the operating kind of the governance of ICANN as a whole. Thanks.
That's outstanding. And Fiona is going to go next. Fiona is one of the key authors of the affirmation of commitments back in September of 2009. And it has two pieces of it. It has a handful of commitments that ICANN makes to the global internet community, but it also has some reviews that are required to be done by the community. So Fiona, what's your thought about bringing the affirmation into the bylaws?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think the affirmation has 3 pieces. It has the commitments of ICANN, the commitments of the U.S. government, the NTIA, to the system and the model, and then this idea of this multi-stakeholder review. And I think just contextually, prior to the affirmation, what would happen every couple of years, as NTIA would issue an NOI or hold a public meeting and ask for stakeholder feedback in terms of how ICANN, and again, this used to be referred to as the DNS experiment, and you can blame Becky for those words, how it was evolving and how it was developing and assessing that. And the idea of the affirmation was to take this role that NTIA sort of shepherded or facilitated through our NOIs and make it a true community bottom-up multi-stakeholder process. So to the extent this construct has been useful to the community, I think it's great that we enshrine and institutionalize this in the bylaws to actually let the community assess ICANN's implementation and the progress of the tasks that the community has asked ICANN to do. So we're very supportive of taking that construct and making it a permanent structure.
And David, turning to you, one of the key parts of the .com Act was a requirement that the bylaws changes that you just heard your colleagues speak about would have to be adopted. And Commerce would have to certify that they're adopted before turning over to Congress the report. What was your thinking behind that design?
So there are several reasons for that, but not the least of which is if we are committed to the idea that the multi-stakeholder process is going to produce a multi-stakeholder empowerment that allows them to be in control as a community over the direction of ICANN and a number of the other things that are enshrined in the affirmation of commitments, then those things should be in place before we make any changes to the current system, to the current way IANA is stewarded through commerce. In terms of the affirmation of commitments themselves, we couldn't be happier at the Commerce Committee to see that the community is working to incorporate the AOC into the bylaws. Chairman Walden in particular spent a lot of time at each of our hearings delineating specific pieces of the AOC and of the contract itself, frankly, with ICANN for the IANA function that he thought were important checks on the way the system works and that should be incorporated. into any successor mechanism. So to see that the multi-stakeholder community heard up what we said and agreed with us and is making those kinds of changes as well is something that we're really happy to see happening.
No, that's outstanding. And then, Steve, when you think about the affirmation commitments, 2009, you were on the board, instrumental in that agreement. What are your thoughts about having that, well, go away once the bylaws reflect the commitments and reviews?
I was on the board. I wasn't in a leadership position, but certainly was in the room when the original draft of the affirmation commitments was presented to the board. I think the idea of, and probably more to the point, I've now watched and how this has played out and been directly involved in helping manage the second accountability and transparency review team process when Fiona was on it as well. I think those reviews, which are in some sense the operational core of the affirmation of commitments, that's the part that actually has the teeth in and causes a focus of attention, are a very good thing. I'm all in favor of it. They're expensive. They take time, energy. There's an opportunity cost because of those that other things don't get done. And nonetheless, I would still say they're very important. The devil is in the details. From my point of view, having watched all of these, there's four reviews: ATRT, which I mentioned, a security, stability, resiliency review, a who is review, and a consumer choice and trust and competition. And I may have misordered some of those terms. In my mind, they break into two groups. The first two are generic and all important, and I have no trouble with those. The latter two are somewhat specific, and the context changes over time. And so, again, I don't have any real problem with the thrust of those, but the details of how they're worded is, in fact, quite important. We have been, for example, in the who is area, conscious of the status of the how who is works, which has got its roots going all the way back to the very beginning, when computers filled a room and the person you wanted to contact was the system administrator or his supervisor, which led to the notion of a technical contact and an administrative contact. Does that apply properly to today's world? And so there's some updating of terminology. We've been working very hard over the past 3 years with trying to re-explore what actually works from a technical basis and a policy basis, as opposed to just trying to put more pressure on the existing structure. So I'm conscious that the precise wording of the who is, for example, is not aligned with the need to explore and examine all of that, but the broad thrust of it is certainly fine. So maybe gone a little further down that path than you might be interested in, but modulo getting those details right, I think is fine, and happy to do that. Let me take the opportunity to also talk about the adoption of the bylaws that will come out of this process. I mentioned earlier that if the .com Act passes, one of the things that it provides is a much clearer path forward, which is, I think, a very good thing. And an important part of that path, which David's mentioned and others, is that there's a sequence of requirements. Larry Strickland will have to certify to Congress that the proposals that have come from the community are consistent with the conditions that were laid down, and that we have gone further than that and actually adopted the bylaw changes that are implied by that. So that's a significant step. That's and a real. That's more than a promise. That's an actual transition. A point that is important from where I sit, and I've been interested to see how little attention it gets, is that the process of changing our bylaws requires going through our bylaw process. We have a standard method of adopting changes to bylaws. We change the bylaws in little ways from time to time, and occasionally in big ways. So we're going to have to run that process. So that involves resolutions passed by the board, actually a pair of them, one that proposes a change and then puts it out for public comment, and then assuming the public comments are not negative or hopefully even stronger or positive, then we come back and we pass another resolution that adopts those bylaws and puts them formally into force. So one of the things that I've been looking at, again, in the spirit of the devil's in the details, is how to align our regular processes with this somewhat extraordinary sequence and get all of that to work in a timely fashion. So in addition to what's visible, highly visible, and that has been to the community, is another layer, and probably several more layers underneath that, of trying to get things ordered and prepared so that we can move smoothly through that process. And I think you'll see a bit more on that. All of that's in the spirit of trying to make this work right and get it to smoothly through the system. There's, as it also has been mentioned, we don't know the exact shape of what's going to come out from the cross-community working group. And although we're strongly in favor of enhanced accountability and improved review processes and related stuff, it makes a lot of difference as to exactly what the form of that is. When ICANN was constructed in 1998, there was a lot of concern about exactly these same things, and some of the models that are being considered today are actually similar to what was considered but not adopted then, for reasons that were pretty clear on the table. And so there's some delicate points yet to be navigated here.
Yeah, and our next round of question is to assess whether those details and the devil in between the details is causing some challenges at achieving consensus in the multi-stakeholder community that's working on it. Several folks at this table, myself included, have been part of that. And we fly off later today to Paris for 2 days of face-to-face meetings, as Steve mentioned. So Becky, I think you had a follow-up to what Steve was saying, and then let's assess whether we see potential challenges achieving consensus in the multi-stakeholder community.
So, lest you think this is just a love fest panel up here, Fiona accused me of being the author of the words of the DNS experiment. Well, it was an experiment. ICANN was something new that we had not seen, and it was in 1998. Although I had to raise my right hand and swear that it wasn't an experiment and that I wasn't making it up as I went along. I did have to swear that to Chairman Toza. The truth is, it was an experiment, and we didn't know how it was going to work out, and it has evolved. So the fact that membership was considered and discarded in 2003, for example, or even in 1998, to me is not an indication of anything other than it wasn't the right thing then. Now, it might be the right thing. I happen to think it is, but it might not be. That's a reasonable discussion, but the fact that it was rejected in 1999 and 2003 is not very persuasive to me about most anything other than this organization has evolved enormously to the good, I think, since that time. And so I hope that we are bringing an open mind to the table with respect to the details and the form and all of that. And I very much look forward to being able to come back to the community and the board with some clear direction on the structure of the organization after this weekend. But I think that the nature of an experiment is that you respond to change over time. And although I'm not an expert on the scientific method, I think that's, part of what we're doing here.
And Becky, you mentioned the structural adjustments that may or may not be called for. But in addition to that, you've been the author of the lead rapporteur, as we say, bringing a lot of elements into the bylaws on the existing structure. Things like core values, mission statement, and commitments. We talked earlier with Matt about the bringing in the affirmation of commitments in. But there are many places where it's very challenging to achieve consensus once the details make their way into black and white on paper. So I'm just asking, without getting too deep into the details, where do you see as our largest risk of failing to achieve consensus in the next few weeks?
Well, I think that we will fail to achieve consensus unless we carefully calibrate what is workstream 1 and what is workstream 2. That is a critical distinction, and we've got to get that right and not put unnecessary things into workstream 1, but not avoid dealing with necessary things as part of workstream 1. I do think that we have had some very interesting input from the Government Advisory Committee in the form of a sort of compiled individual government responses. It's to me, a very interesting and informative tool, and something that I hope the GAC will use in the future to give the community a better sense of where their discussion is at any point in time. But I do think that there are some issues raised by that, and I think we have to figure out a way to accommodate the fact that the GAC is probably not going to be completely settled on what it wants anytime quickly based on those things. And then finally, I hope everybody comes to Paris prepared to talk in concrete terms rather than sort of platitudes. And I'll just give you just one example of it. You can hear when the conversation is not constructive, everybody on both sides of the argument will say things like, we have to do exactly the least amount possible to get what we need. Whatever we do has to stand the test of time. And there's one other that I hear all the time. All of those things are completely and absolutely true, and every single person involved in this believes them and agrees with them, but they don't help us get past that. So let's now have the conversation about what is it that you think is not going to stand the test of time? What is it that you think that is more than is necessary? Assuming that we can have that kind of a conversation in Paris, I think we should be okay.
Matthew, what are your thoughts on sticking points for consensus?
I just want to make sure that we're not leaving the audience with the impression that everything is up for grabs in this upcoming meeting and that we don't have much consensus. We do have a lot of consensus. We have a lot of consensus around the powers that we would like the community to be able to exercise. Where we don't have consensus and where there will be some good debate and discussion in this upcoming meeting is the mechanism by which the community exercises those powers. So it's important to understand that that's the issue that really remains the big issue for discussion. And even there, we're pretty close. We're talking about two models to exercise those powers that aren't that different. The implications of them are somewhat different, but they aren't that different at a principled level. So just so you understand that there is a good amount of consensus, there's certainly a lot of agreement on community powers, and the issue now is really the implementation mechanism.
Thank you. And Fiona, David, any comments on what you've been able to observe and the consensus concerns?
Again, I think it'd be a little bit premature for us to comment on the specifics, as Becky and Steve and Matthew and others are getting on a plane and going to Paris and trying to sort of come to a conclusion on some of this for the community to consider. I would just offer the following observation, which is, we could have done this at NTI similar to past practice. We could have just done an NOI, asked for public feedback, and made a decision as the U.S. government. And I think the decision we made was to sort of really double down on the multi-stakeholder model, as Larry talked about a little bit earlier today, not just domestically as we try to deploy this model domestically, something we've more successfully done internationally for 17 years, and domestically having a little bit more problems trying to do as we start that. But as a result of this process, as a result of all the conversations, as a result of all the exasperation, I think as Larry referenced earlier, the system is stronger, and it's going to be stronger as a result of all this effort and this work. And one of the things I think I'm most impressed by is the sort of the development and the exposure and the sort of creation of new leaders in this world and in this model. And I think it's been a nice side effect of the system. So again, at NTIA, we're fully confident this is going to work, and I think Larry said that this morning. So we're anxious to see what comes out of next week's meeting.
David?
I would agree with most of what Fiona said. I think I would also add for that, and this may be my bias as a legislative staffer, but it warms my heart a little bit to see the fight going on between folks that are trying to find the best way to get to the right answer. The policy disagreements, the procedural and implementation disagreements, those ultimately will produce better outcomes. And if following this, everyone had shown up and said, we all know how we're going to do this, and we all know what the right outcome is, and this is exactly how it's going to be, I think we would be a little more concerned, just as Chairman Walden and Chairman Upton felt that stress tests would be an important part of any process. Having the community duke it out and figure out the right answers should also be a part of that process. So we're happy to watch that happening and see what the outcome is going to be.
And David, before I turn to Steve Crocker, there has been some discussion of what happens when people who mean well but see things in different ways can't work out the details. Even if we all agreed on the objective, we can't work out the details. It's really challenging to achieve a consensus-based compromise. And the temptation or the exhortation of many in the last couple of weeks has been, if it's difficult, push it off to work stream 2. If we can't come to this, push it off to work stream 2. So I wanted to clarify, just by read to the audience, this distinction between work stream 1 and 2. What does that mean? I mean, the Naval Construction Brigade, the Seabees, say, the difficult we do right away, the impossible takes a little longer. That's work stream 2. And if it's impossible, it'll never get done. In our case, work stream 1 mechanisms, quote, are those that when in place would provide the community with confidence that any accountability mechanism that would further enhance ICANN's accountability could be implemented if it had consensus support from the community. And here's the key phrase: even if it were to encounter ICANN management resistance, or if it were against the interest of ICANN as a corporate entity, quote. So that's the distinction that our group is working on, is that we need to load into work stream 1 the powers necessary to be sure, because we lose the leverage after work stream 1 once the transition is over. So it's not about things that are easy versus things that are hard, difficult versus impossible. It's about achieving the powers necessary to let the community have the accountability and ability to challenge the corporation. So with that, Steve, I know you've been an active advocate of work stream 2 items lately. What are your thoughts on that distinction and that definition that we've adopted?
Well, I appreciate your framing of it that way, because that gives me an opportunity to set the record straight yet again. There's implicit in the way that you phrase that, Steve, is that there's a distinction between the function of the ICANN board in its fiduciary responsibilities for a legal entity, which is the corporation, versus the responsibilities to the community at large and the health of the internet. We don't see it that way, and our bylaws very explicitly, and our articles of incorporation very explicitly talk about why we exist and what we're for. So there has been, and from the very beginning, plenty of access and mechanisms for modifying and updating our function and our bylaws. So I view what's going on here as more of that rather than a qualitative distinction, and that there has never been and cannot ever be a distinction between what's good for the internet and what's good for the corporation. although I know that that's an idea that gets a lot of traction. It's kind of useful shillelagh to hit us over the head with, but it just isn't true. So that's one of the key things. I agree very strongly with Becky that it's easy for us to all agree on the platitudes, and then it gets into the specifics. And I don't know how, whether it was purposeful or just accidentally surreptitious, not surreptitious, serendipitous, that we got put at opposite ends of these tables as a way of illustrating the spectrum of thought that we have present in this thing. As mentioned, this conversation is taking place here today, and people are going to get on airplanes tonight and fly to Paris and then be locked in rooms for 2 days. I am going to Paris, but not for that meeting. I'm going a couple of days later, and we'll arrive exactly at the end, and we'll take pictures of the crime scene and see who's still standing and so forth. We have. As a side thing, it turns out that there's a few other things going on. One of them is that we're in the beginning stages of searching for a next CEO, and our CEO search committee is meeting on Sunday in Paris at the same hotel. I'm on that search committee. I'm not going to be at the CCWG meeting. We have a really first-class set of board members who are going to be there. I mean, very active and knowledgeable. So I'm completely satisfied that we'll be well represented there.
Thank you. We're going to do one more round of questions here, and then we'll open up for some audience questions, which should leave 20-25 minutes for that. The Internet Governance Forum USA is a feeder event for the Internet Governance Forum hosted by the United Nations later this year in Brazil. One of the key items from an IGF-USA event is we try to do readouts and report outs to be able to inform our colleagues at the global IGF what it was that we discussed. And that's an audience that is keenly interested at the role of governments. And the United Nations, who sponsors and runs the IGF, has a series of meetings coming up later this year, the World Summit on the Information Society that will lead into the IGF. And that leads me to want to ask the panelists what's your sense of whether the governments that are significantly involved at ICANN, we call it the GAC, the Governmental Advisory Committee, but individual governments have their voice as well. Are they on a track to be participating in and be comfortable with the kind of proposals that we currently have on the table? Would anyone like to venture an answer to that? Becky?
I mean, I think it's very difficult to discern a lot of consensus from the compilation of views. And so and we know the pace at which the GAC works, which is not, I mean, it shouldn't be surprising to any of us. It's the nature of the beast. I am concerned about that. I do have to say we have had good participation in the CCWG by different governments. The participation by the governments has actually been a sort of an order of magnitude more, sort of more present in this process than in other processes where there was intended to be collaboration. So that's a very hopeful sign. I have some concerns that there are some folks some governments that appear to be really dug in, and I hope that the processes available to the GAC allow that to be resolved in time.
All right. Any other panelists want to tackle the government question? Matthew.
I think we have to kind of break it down into two parts, one of which is the engagement and the positions of GAC members, and the other one is what is the role potentially of the GAC or governments in the new ICANN, if you will, post-transition. There's no doubt that I think that the engagement by governments in the working groups has been very good. We have seen it's very difficult for governments to operate in that kind of an environment. It doesn't match their typical operating procedures, particularly for those who come to these kind of processes new. What we have seen is we've seen public positions on the transition on accountability that have been restated quite frequently, that sometimes it concerns me that they haven't been adequately listened to. And so I think that we may see, when it comes to the public comment period from when the ICG puts out 3 proposals, names, numbers, and protocols, we may see some more input from governments at that point in time. The question that will have to be wrestled with is, how does the GAC and how do governments fit within a new community-empowered model, and what role do they have in that model? And what Becky was referring to was some input that we've received from the GAC countries about their views on this new community mechanism, the options that are under consideration. And it's not hugely clear from that input which way the governments are looking at this, whether or not they believe they should still have an advisory role, which I think is certainly our preference, or whether it should be some other role. And I think that will be an issue that will have to be worked through.
That's great. Fiona, David, or Steve?
Sure. I mean, I think it's difficult to speak for the GAC as a whole at this point, but I think in speaking for the U.S. government, obviously, we submitted comments as a part of that process, and I think this is all publicly available for those that are interested. But we would look forward to the government continuing the role they have in an advisory capacity, and we think key to that and key to governments participating in the multi-stakeholder model and actually making sure their views are addressed is to make sure that we have consensus government advice, and that's the advice that triggers the current bylaw provision that we would expect to see contained. And I know the Accountability Group has done a great amount of work on that with Stress Test 18 to deal with that, and as the U.S. government, we're very supportive of that process.
Fantastic. Steve, David?
So there's some important points that have been mentioned here that I want to sort of revisit and support. There's certainly no question that the governments are more engaged now than they were years ago. This is a good thing. This process is placing some pressure on the GAC in 2 respects. But the pressures that I'm going to mention are pressures that have been there and have been addressed even without this and will continue afterwards. One is I'll call it the external aspect. What is the role of the GAC as a whole in the overall governance process for ICANN? And the other is the internal set of pressures. How does the GAC do its work? How do the governments interact within the GAC and reach their decisions? What does consensus mean exactly? I would say that all of this is extremely healthy. But it's not easy. It's hard, and the governments are spread over a spectrum ranging from, first of all, the knowledge spectrum, how much the individual governments or their representatives know. Interests vary to some extent. The resources that each government puts into this vary to some extent. And so there is not a single data point that you can point to and say, oh, well, the governments are here. They're really kind of a spectrum, and you can sort of try to plot the movement of the mass over time. I'll just leave it at that. But if one wants to look at that, I think you have to look at it with that perspective. But I think the overall direction, although it's not paced very fast, and although it's not entirely uniform and to some extent not 100% predictable, nonetheless, I think the movement in general has been very positive.
Thank you. So while we wait for somebody to line up, I wanted to ask the question we were all sort of afraid to ask a little earlier. The best estimates of timing for the completion of this transition, which is the relinquishment of the IANA contract, puts it sometime next summer, maybe even next fall of 2016, which sort of brings the transition discussion right into the teeth of the campaign season for the US presidential and congressional elections. So let's just be realistic about it. Let's expect there's some political rhetoric about the transition, losing the internet of some kind. We can expect that kind of rhetoric. But do we need to fear that, or can we simply take it on and deal with it because we have good principles, good intentions, and are actually pursuing the right solution? Are we afraid of having public dialogue in the middle of an election season about this transition? And I'll take any of the panelists who want to tackle that. David.
So at the risk of dodging around the question a little bit, I think it's important that we realize that this is an ongoing process, and it's not like we're going to have to wait until next spring, next summer to be having these discussions in Washington, D.C. We've had an ongoing conversation on Capitol Hill for the last year between the House and the Senate and between our different partisan factions on the House and in the Senate. We are going to continue between now and whenever the proposal gets put forth in front of NTIA to continue to work with our colleagues at NTIA to monitor the situation, to make sure that things are going in the right direction. And I think it's imperative that the multi-stakeholder community stay focused on meeting NTIA's criteria. The best way that you can try to make this transition go smoothly once a proposal is agreed on is to make sure that when it gets in front of NTIA, it's easy for them to say they've met or exceeded all the criteria that have been put forth. If anyone in the accountability group is not looking through this with the prism of, does this meet NTIA's criteria, I would urge you to make sure that that is a part of every step of the process for you.
Excellent admonition there. Becky?
I just want to say that actually is one of the virtues of the .com Act. It has started and produced a bipartisan agreement on this that makes me, I am sure we're going to hear some rhetoric about it, but I feel like serious work has been done on developing a bipartisan position on it, which puts us in very good shape.
Matt.
I don't think we should be worried. For so long as we remain responsive to and we are open to and listen to the various communities. We have been doing incredible work in these working groups. It's been very thorough. It's been very measured. It has taken a lot of time to come to where we are now, and that debate is not over, but it's continuing. So I have every confidence that will be the case. And as long as we have that confidence and we can clearly express what the roadmap is for when we get to the transition, then I think we should not have any concerns about this being derailed through external political pressures. Thanks.
These are encouraging answers because it suggests we should take the time to get this right and not worry about the political calendar. Any further thoughts on that? And if not, we'll turn to the line. Chris, introduce yourself, please, before you ask your question.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Chris Wilson with 21st Century Fox. This is a two-part question. They're tangentially related to Becky and Matthew. Considering the amount of time and energy that's been already devoted to Workstream 1 and still to be determined, still further work to be done, is there a concern from your point of view that there won't be enough energy or oxygen in the room to really focus on Workstream 2 down the road? And then tangentially, David, can we expect additional congressional oversight of ICANN and IANA generally post-transition effectuation next whatever it is next year, thinking 2017, 2018 down the road, because obviously these issues will continue. And frankly, there's issues that have been raised during some of the hearings you all have had that have just sort of percolated within the accountability discussion generally that I think will continue even after the transition. So the question is whether there'll be sort of continued oversight beyond the transition. So,
great question.
I'll go first. 2018 is a long time in Congress time, but I feel pretty confident saying yes, oversight will continue going forward.
yay.
Volunteer burnout is an issue. People are working really, really, really hard and very intensely. That said, there is also a lot of passion about getting this right. And so I think on balance, we'll be able to continue the momentum. We, as always, need to increase the worker bees around the table. That's a challenge, and it's something that we're all very conscious of.
I think it is a genuine fear, but I think for so long as we have the support of ICANN, the organization of the various communities, of all those parties who are interested in this, then we can do this. Workstream 2 is important for other reasons, and I don't think we've fully explored the complexity of Workstream 2, because while in Workstream 1 we have these various community powers, we have to also ensure that we continue to monitor them for their effectiveness and how they're being implemented. So there is a whole other dimension of Workstream 2, whether you call it Workstream 2 or something else, that will need to go on, will be ongoing as well.
And David, if you would take a follow-up to Chris's question, what would be the mechanism of congressional oversight once the IANA contract is gone? Would that be something you'd coordinate with Fiona's group at NTIA?
We're speaking way out in the hypotheticals here, but Congress has hearings on things all the time. So I feel confident that if it's an issue that members of Congress care about, they'll still be able to have hearings on it.
So maybe just to clarify and reiterate this point, NTI is not going away. That's not that I'm aware of. Department of Commerce is not going away from the system or this process. All we're doing is taking this final step in the privatization process. And once we have a proposal that meets the criteria, meets the conditions, has this broad support, then, and we go through all the steps that are needed, we will take the appropriate steps to terminate the contract. NTI will still be an active participant in ICANN and all things ICANN. We'll still represent the U.S. government in the Governmental Advisory Committee. NTI actually oversees, is responsible for the .USDLD. Like, we're not leaving. And so to the extent Congress has concerns about any NTI activity, I fully would expect there to be hearings on any and all of what we do.
Life goes on, right? Next questioner, please introduce yourself.
Greetings. My name is Matthew Fowle. I'm a local software developer. I guess my question is around the domain privacy shielding. Right now, there's a lot of trepidation and fear on the internet that a mechanism that people rely on DNS, the ability to cloak your actual contact information behind a third party, is in jeopardy. I don't think a lot of people really understand they don't understand the governance or the multi-stakeholder process that would be involved with something like that being raised, and they don't understand how something like that would be reconciled. I also don't think that they understand what means they have available to participate and to influence and to be recognized as stakeholders in that process. There's been a lot of talk on the first open session that we had here around questions from the audience about how do we get people involved with internet governance and how do we get them aware. And I guess I think this is a really good case study where I'd like to hear some answers from the panel about what we can do to give people a better sense of how they can be good, active citizens participating in this government process, and what ICANN can do to reveal how they are governing for this very important topic for a lot of people.
As you're thinking of an answer, panel, to contextualize this a little bit, Matthew's bringing up the notion of whether privacy and proxy will be available to everyone, regardless of what purpose they're using the internet for. In the community at ICANN, of which 10,000 or so people who share your concern have written in, the community is just at the beginning stages of figuring out what the rules should be. It's going to take quite a while to figure out whether there would be any circumstances or domain uses that would not be allowed to cloak their identity through the directory services or who is. If, for instance, they were accepting money or selling goods and services, and there's a consumer protection angle. So it's a balancing act. So to be a participant in that, you should do more than just write 10,000 form letters to ICANN in a public comment period. I think showing up and participating on a working group would be the next step. But let me ask the panel about any reactions to that.
Just to add, I think I've participated in a lot of institutions and structures over the last 15 or 16 years, and ICANN is one of the most open systems I've ever seen. It doesn't require you to get on a plane, although you're welcome to, and you can always come to any meeting anywhere around the world. But all the ICANN meetings, and maybe Dr. Crocker wants to speak to this in more detail, are open and public accessible, and you can participate through Adobe Connect, and you can file comments. So all it takes, as Vince said this morning, is using the internet. You know, the internet gives you this great tool to participate in the process. It's important to do that. All of these working groups that develop recommendations that then go out for extensive public comment, all of their meetings are open and you can ask questions as well. So it does require a certain amount of awareness and maybe a network of making sure people are aware, and maybe ISOC and the local chapter can help with that. I'm looking at David. So maybe there's something that can be happening there, but I don't know if Steve has something to add.
Your question is right at the heart of the things that I was alluding to when I talked about the who is details. It's very, very important. We have, just to paint two extremes, you have a position of typically law enforcement and intellectual property owners say, we have to know exactly who's behind every domain name, and we want those details, and we don't want any resistance to finding that. That's one extreme. And the other is, I don't see any reason why our personal details need to be exposed to everybody, and there are good personal and often commercial reasons why we need to cloak those. And then when you look practically, what happens is that no matter what the rules are, if people want to be shielded, they'll find a way to do that. They'll use third parties and proxies and whatever. So we're in the middle, approximately. I don't know if the middle is exactly the right mark point, but we're in the process of a very substantial and thoughtful reexamination of all of this. And the first part of that process was a commissioning of an expert working group to build the right terms of reference to pull out not only the extreme kind of things that I talked about, but several layers more subtle, and put those on the table, not to make decision, because that would not be an open process, but to stimulate the process. And we did that precisely because there had been previous attempts, many repeated attempts, that had stalled and not gotten anywhere because of different points of view just didn't come together. So we're in the process of kicking off another policy development process through the GNSO that is aimed at bringing all of that out front and looking at it. I don't know where it's going to wind up, but it could well provide a win-win kind of situation. And on the other hand, I think I'd be happy to put money down that it will not satisfy everybody.
Matthew?
Yeah, I think this is a really important issue. Privacy is under threat everywhere. But more importantly, I think one of the things that we're realizing when it comes to the issue of volunteer burnout and other issues that have been raised is that there is a lot going on at ICANN at the same time. And this year has been particularly strenuous for the participants because of the IANA transition. So there are things that maybe are incredibly important, fundamentally important, but the attention span of those involved is limited. So all I can say, the best way to engage is just to sign up to the non-commercial users constituency or some newsletters, or just get involved that way, because we also, I am a part of that constituency, but we also need to hear from those outside the community about what's of concern to them. So I think it's kind of a two-way street. We're supposed to bring the issues to you, but at the same time, it's good for you to participate, and even if it's just peripherally, and bring the issues to us. Thanks.
Thank you. And Joe, next question, please. And I think this will be our final question.
Hi, Joe Wright from Bloomberg BNA. I think Becky Burr brought up earlier the comments submitted by the GAC to the accountability group, and Fiona Alexander specifically mentioned the stress test 18, which had to do with the need for a potential bylaws change in ICANN to make sure that GAC advice will always be consensus advice if it's going to be considered by the board, and I took great interest in seeing in the GAC comments that went to the group that the United States specifically said this is a necessary aspect of the proposal to meet the NTIA's criteria. And I know that NTIA and Larry Strickling have been very careful throughout this process to always say, we're not going to put our thumb on the scale. We're not going to tell these groups how to do their workings. And I think this is the first time that a specific potential output of the accountability group has sort of received that sort of treatment from the U.S. government. So I'm wondering, as you get into these late stages of getting the proposal together for the next comment period, are the U.S. government's input specifically at this late stage causing any consternation within the accountability group, and particularly when they are maybe at odds with some of the other submissions from other GAC members when it comes to being concerned about being able to get consensus a little bit down the road.
Joe, we'll let the panelists answer that, but one clarification. The board will always consider advice from the governments or GAC, whether it's consensus or not. The only outcome of stress test 18 says that the board's special obligation, which it gives to no other party but government, the special obligation to try and find a mutually acceptable solution is carried with GAC advice. And that special obligation is the only one for which GAC consensus would be required. And then when you characterize the US government, it has a different role in this transition because it's the government that specified the 4 requirements for the transition. So in some sense, the US government's position is, as the decider of whether the requirements have been met, we see this requirement as needing something like a stress test 18. That gives the panelists the time to develop great answers to that tough question. So who wants to take a stab at it? Becky.
So I think there's not unanimity, but I think there's very strong support and has been from the beginning for stress test 18 in the CCWG, and in part because we understand what the U.S. government's criteria has been all along, and that is an important safeguard against government capture. So that's the way in which the group has been thinking about that, and NTIA's comments to me were quite consistent with everything with discussion. The other thing is that although the NTIA has taken a sort of, the point here is community consensus for the proposal that comes up, so long as it meets these criteria. Larry hasn't been shy about expressing his views. And so they're not all that surprising. Now, there was one aspect of the U.S. government's comments that has gotten a little bit of debate, and that was the notion that there should be some kind of trial period for the independent review, for the enhanced independent review. I can't say that surprised me, because I've heard Larry express his concern that we figure out some way to actually improve the independent review process, and that is something that I think everybody's committed to. To the extent that, I take those comments very, very seriously, but I think that the USG is entitled and expected to provide input as a government in all of the ways that other governments are. We're not going to be able to satisfy all of the governments, because if you read the GAC advice, you can see that there's a lot of room there. But I don't think that people feel outside of the we have to meet the criteria established by NTIA that the input is veiled direction or anything like that.
Any other panelists want to tackle that? Thank you, Joe, for the question. And we're wrapping up exactly on time, which will give you all an opportunity to move to lunch down on the first floor in the Columbian Square. But before you do, you're going to hear keynote remarks there by Julie Zeller with the State Department and Kathy Brown, the CEO of the Internet Society. So before you get up, please help me to thank the panelists for energizing all of us on this important transition.